All right, now we're looking at mankind as well as life forms. And we're distinguishing between macro and micro evolution, or changes within a species, versus changing from one species to the next. We're at K94 now, at this address. We need to remember that variation does not prove the general theory of evolution, variation within a species. The creationists would predict variation, but there would be limits to that variation. We want to begin by looking at the evidence that was observed by Charles Darwin. What he did see, what did he see that caused him to conclude that the evidence favored evolution as an explanation of origins? Charles Darwin made a trip as a naturalist on the ship the Beagle around the world, and particularly the Galapagos Islands. He was able to observe things that he thought supported evolution. He observed that finches on some of the islands had large beaks adapted for breaking the seeds. Finches on the other islands had different beaks that were adapted for reaching into the bark and get insects. And on varying islands, there were varying finches. Dr. Patton says, I think he observed variation, but they were still finches. They didn't change from one thing to another. Another line of evidence that he pointed to was the pepper moth, which before the Industrial Revolution, with the trees still clean of factory soot, was somewhat camouflaged and lighter colored. On the other hand, whereas the black-colored pepper moth stuck out like a sore thumb. If you're a bird looking for supper, and you eat pepper moths, then obviously the black ones are in trouble. However, after the Industrial Revolution, the black ones are now camouflaged, the light-colored ones stick out like sore thumbs, and lo and behold, the numbers did shift. Of course, we observed that there were black ones before and light ones before also. There were light ones and black ones afterwards. Nothing came about that was new. There was a shift in the relative numbers of the population only. And that's all that we see when we look at the pepper moth. We don't see anything new. They didn't become eagles, or they didn't become birds of any other thing of that nature. And Dr. Morris says, perhaps the classic proof of evolution has been the observed color shift in the population of England's peppered moths. Pictures of dark and light peppered moths on various tree trunks have appeared in every biology textbook. It's on the tip of the tongues of evolutionary spokesmen worldwide. Here's the well-told scenario. In the early 1800s, nearly all the individual peppered moths were of a light gray speckled color, active mostly at night. They needed to hide by day from predatory birds. Since trees and rocks were typically covered with mottled light gray lichens, the moths were effectively camouflaged. A rare peppered moth exhibited a dark color and was easily seen by birds. Thus, they seldom survived. On average, over 98% of all the species were of the light variety, yet both dark and light were of the same species and were fully infertile. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and the air filled with soot, covering the trees and rocks with a toxic film, killing the lichens and darkening the trees. Soon the light variety of moth was easily seen, while the darker were camouflaged. By the turn of the century, 9% of the moths were dark. When English medical doctor Bernard Kettlewell studied the phenomena in the 1950s, it became Darwin's missing evidence. Natural selection was in view there. Creationists were never concerned with this population shift, however. In fact, they were amused as evolutionists made such a big fuss over it. If this is the best proof of evolution, then evolution is without proof. They didn't become something other than moths. Remember that both varieties were present at the start, with a mix of genes producing lights favored over the mix of genes producing darks. As the environment changed, the dark variety had greater opportunity to pass on their genetic mix, and percentages changed. All the while, the two types were interfertile. No new genes were produced, and certainly no new species resulted. This is natural selection in action, but not evolution. Adaptation happens, but the changes are limited. The textbooks seldom point out that in recent decades, as England has cleaned its atmosphere, the shift has reversed, and now the light moths are the more common form once again. Remember, this shift and shift back, again, have nothing whatsoever to do with the origin of moths, or how moths and people could have share a common ancestor. And now comes the revelation that Kettlewell's compelling argument has not been verified by other investigators. Furthermore, we now know that neither dark nor light moths ever spend their days on exposed tree trunks or rocks, as depicted in the famous textbook pictures. His original associations have even admitted that the photographs were faked, that the moths were glued onto the tree. Thus the star witness for evolution has perjured itself, and knowledgeable evolutionists are recommending it not be used. But they're still in the textbooks. What a wonderful time to be a creationist, when even the supposed best proof of evolution in action is so flimsy that it cannot stand the test of truth. Dr. Don Patton. What is creation science? Of course, the assumption is that these things will add up to become greater things. Small changes you can see over millions of years that you can't see will accumulate. Well, do they accumulate? That's an assumption we don't observe. And science is, of course, what we observe. Can we test that assumption? I think we can. We look, for example, at Drosophila and bacteria, which multiply extremely rapidly. Drosophila has a new generation every 2 weeks, whereas bacteria have a new generation every 20 minutes. And so we observe billions of generations of bacteria. Did they change? Not really. They're still Drosophila, and there's still 3 kinds of bacteria that were observed 300 years ago. There is some variation, yes, curly-winged Drosophila, different colored eyes, some variation observed in bacteria, certainly, but still 3 types and still a fruit fly. And we have a relatively long time that intervenes. Notice the statement by Michael Del Sol, Professor of Biology, University of Lyon, writing in the Encyclopedia of the Life Sciences, if mutation were a variation of value to the species, then the evolution of Drosophila should have proceeded with extreme rapidity, yet the facts entirely contradict the validity of this theoretical deduction. And it is obviously theoretical, we don't observe it. For we have seen that Drosophila type has been known since the beginning of the tertiary period, that is for about 50 million years, and it has not been modified in any way during that time. Every 2 weeks, a new generation, 50 million years according to them. Of course, I disagree with their time system, but playing the game their way to see how it comes out. We say that 50 million years and a new generation every 2 weeks, no change in any way. I think we see a challenge to that secondary assumption that says, given enough time and enough generations, it will all add up to a new species. Michael Del Sol, Professor of Biology, University of Lyon. The generation involved here would be the equivalent of billions of years of generations for humans, but he says no change of any kind. Likewise with bacteria, notice the statement of Dr. Braun in his book Bacterial Genetics. That is, the potential mutations of a given biotype are normally limited, else we should have been able to observe drastic evolutionary changes in laboratory studies with bacteria. Despite the rapid rate of propagation and the enormous size of attainable populations, changes within initially homogeneous bacterial populations apparently do not progress beyond certain boundaries under experimental conditions. Now here is another observation we see, not just variation, but we see boundaries to that variation, and that observation is often ignored. Compare a quotation by Colin Patterson, British Museum of Natural History, Cladistics, BBC. No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever gotten near it, and most of the current argument in neo-Darwinism is about this question. We hear, though, a lot about the variation of bacteria, and that's often presented as evidence for evolutions. Interesting information has come to light recently from Medical Tribune. Since the article which says, it may be time to rethink our thoughts about the mechanisms for antibiotic resistance patterns, the anaerobic bacteria from the bowels of 3 members of an 1845 Arctic expedition have survived 140 years and are showing resistance patterns to modern biotics. Current theories suggest that antibiotic resistance is linked to long-term exposure to antibiotics. In other words, this is a major problem to the evidence for evolution. We see bacteria become resistant. Needless to say, they became resistant and didn't change to be able to avoid. Antibiotics were not developed until long after those 19th century bacteria and their host had been buried in the Arctic permafrost. Consider what John D. Morris states. Often the claim is made in biology classes that evolution has been observed in certain microbes, germs that over time have developed a resistance to antibiotics. For instance, penicillin is generally now less effective than before. Stronger and more focused drugs have been developed, each with initial benefits, but which must continue to be replaced with something stronger. Now, supergerms defy treatment. One might ask, have these single-celled germs evolved? And does this prove that single-celled organisms evolved into plants and people? As is frequently the case, we must first distinguish between variation, adaptation, and recombination of existing traits. That's called microevolution. And the appearance of new and different genes, body parts, and traits. That's called macroevolution. Does this acquired resistance to antibiotics, this population shift, this dominant exhibition of a previously minority trait point to macroevolution? Since each species of germs remained that same species and nothing new is produced, the answer is no. It stays the same germ. Here's how it works. In a given population of bacteria, many genes are present which express themselves in a variety of ways. In a natural environment, the genes and traits are freely mixed. When exposed to an antibiotic, most of the microbes die, but some, through a fortuitous genetic recombination, possess a resistance to the antibiotic. They are the only ones to reproduce, and their descendants inherit the same genetic resistance. Over time, virtually all possess this resistance, because the others don't survive. Thus, the population has lost the ability to produce individuals with a sensitivity to the antibiotic. No new genetic information was produced. Indeed, genetic information was lost. A new line of research has produced tantalizing results. Evidently, when stressed, some microbes go into a mutation mode, rapidly producing a variety of strains, thereby increasing the odds that some will survive the stress. This has produced some interesting areas for speculation by creationists, but it still mitigates against evolution. There is a tremendous scope of genetic potential already present in the cell, but E. coli bacteria before stress and mutation remain E. coli. Minor change has taken place, but not true evolution, not macro. Furthermore, it has been proven that resistance to many modern biotics was present decades before their discovery. In 1845, sailors on an ill-fated Arctic expedition were buried in the permafrost and remained deeply frozen until bodies were exhumed in 1986. Preservation was so complete that 6 strains of 19th century bacteria found dormant in the contents of the sailors' intestines were able to be revived. When tested, these bacteria were found to possess resistance to several modern-day antibiotics, including penicillin. Since such traits were obviously present prior to penicillin's discovery, and thus could not be an evolutionary development. Here's the point. Mutations, adaptation, variation, diversity, population shifts, etc. all occur. But these are not macro-evolutionary changes. In the Medical Tribune, Batten says it wasn't the penicillin that caused these things to change. They changed long before the penicillin came on the scene. And so obviously that's not the explanation for it. The explanation is that there are some of those bacteria which are antibiotic resistant that naturally occur, and you kill off everything else. That's all that's left. Well, so goes the evidence that is supposed to prove the point. We want to emphasize that there are 2 observations. We see variation. We can call it horizontal because it doesn't lead to a totally different kind. It is also observed variation boundary.